Okay, folks, good morning again. This is Stephen Montagna with WCASA. So we're gonna jump in and get started. Just a little or a few things as we do. I don't know for you folks if any of you are new to webinars or new to using GoToWebinar, which is the service that we use. First of all, I am logged in as Peter Fiala. Peter is our training and events coordinator. So if you see that name, it's still me and or John. It's just that's how we logged into the system. Um, if you're new to GoToWebinar, you should see your control panel or your little GoToWebinar control panel in your on your screen, usually in the top right corner. You should see that you are muted. All of you are automatically muted, but that you have the ability to raise your hand. So raising your hand and or typing something into the questions pane are two of the ways of getting our attention if you have a question or something has come up. So by all means, use those, and we'll do our best to monitor that as we go along. Um, and if you have a question and you're on a computer with a microphone or you're on the phone line dialed in through the phone, I should be able to unmute you and we should be able to hear your question. If we have any problems with that as we do that, again, you can also type a question into the questions pane. I guess, John, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Thank you to everyone for joining us. My name is John Keycaver. I am the lobbyist for the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I want to thank Stephen for putting this together, basically doing all the work to get this ready. So thanks, Stephen. As you may know, also, this is the first of 3 webinars that we have scheduled for the coming few weeks on legislative advocacy. The next one I just want to mention very briefly is scheduled for Thursday, November 29th at noon. We'll get into more detail during that second webinar on how to track legislation, how to find out exactly what's going on with a particular bill or particular budget item. And then the third will be held on December 7th, a Friday at noon again, and that will be focused specifically on the state budget process and advocacy. Some of what we talk about today will be relevant for advocacy around the budget as well, but we'll get into more detail on at that last webinar on the state budget process. So today we're talking, as you know, it's really going to be a primer on the legislative process and a basic legislative advocacy. And we are focused on the state process at this point. I just want to mention very briefly, when you're talking about advocacy, much of what we say is relevant for advocacy on issues of federal relevance or even local issues. But as far as the process goes, and later on when we talk about the state budget in the third webinar, that's obviously that's state level processes and advocacy. The federal system is a whole different beast, and we're focused during this series of webinars on the state process and advocacy. Our agenda for today, just very briefly, we'll review the legislative process, as I said, and then talk about advocacy within those various stages of the legislative process. The first point I want to make, and it's a basic one, but it's very important and really dictates much of what we do, is the simple fact that the legislative process consists of a number of very distinct stages. And each of those stages, as you'll see in here today, has its own rules, it's their own timelines, and their own sets of decision makers. And as you can imagine, all that is very important for targeting your advocacy efforts and for your overall effectiveness. So that's just the main point I want to stress throughout today's presentation is we need to gain an understanding whenever you're interested in working on an issue of what stage you are in, because our processes are broken down into several very distinct stages. And partly because of that, timing is very critical in advocacy work. The first thing you want to do, whether it's whether you've got an issue that you want to proactively take to the legislature, or you're responding to something you've heard about in the press, or that you've heard that there's a bill out there that you may be interested in. You first want to ascertain, okay, at what stage of the process are we in? And we'll get to each of those a little bit later on. But I just want to stress that that's always the first question we ask ourselves. Where exactly are we in the session? What exactly is going on? We have to identify that and really define that before we do anything else. As you may know, we have a 2-year legislative session here in Wisconsin. For instance, uh, we're currently still in the 2012 or rather 2011-2012 legislative session, but it's not the case, as most of you probably know, that the legislators are active during that whole 2-year process and considering bills and so on. Um, but you'll hear us talk about the 2-year legislative session. That's what we're referring to. Obviously, the next legislative session will begin in early January, I believe January 7th. And that legislative session will go for the next 2 years, then 2013, 2014. Because of that, and because there are such distinct stages, um, when you miss something, whether it's a public hearing or a briefing by a state agency during the state budget process, whatever it might be, we've missed it. There's really no going back. Um, uh, that's just to say that ascertaining again exactly where we stand and in the process is just critical. This slide is just an indication. As I said, we have 2-year legislative sessions in Wisconsin, but they're not all, legislators aren't always voting on measures. They're not always considering things as committees. It's really broken down into many stages, and throughout that 2-year period, there are breaks and there are sessions when they're actually on the floor and so on. And this is just the calendar for the current legislative session. And as you can see on there, I know it's small print, but it's just to show you there are distinct periods when what are called floor periods, where legislators are on the floor voting on measures, or potentially the Assembly and the Senate are meeting to vote on bills. And also, as you can see, and what I want to point out is, while we have what we call 2-year legislative sessions, they're not active that whole time. As you can see, for this current session, legislative work was really wrapped up last March. If you look to this slide and you see last general floor period, it was March 6th to the 15th of 2012. So really, we have legislative sessions that are about 15 months long or so. Now, the legislature can always call itself back into, or a special session can be called, or an extraordinary session can be called. But generally speaking, if you're interested in advocating on a legislative matter, it's that 15-month or so period when they're going to be active. And this next slide is just another graphic representation of that legislative calendar, periods when they're, again, on the floor or potentially on the floor voting on measures, times when they're not. Now, that doesn't mean that no activity is going on, obviously, when they're not technically on the floor or during a floor period. That's, for instance, when a lot of committee work takes place. But we'll talk about each of those stages in a moment. Now we'll turn to the actual stages that we're referring to. And again, don't think budget at this point. We'll be discussing that on a later webinar. This is just a representation of the typical process for legislation. How a bill becomes a law. And we'll talk about each of these steps in a moment. But as you can see, bills are drafted, co-sponsors are gained.
Sorry.
That's all right, Stephen. Bills are introduced, they're assigned to a committee. Typically, public hearings are held. The committees then hold what's called an executive session where they vote on particular proposals on bills. Each then that house has a vote, and then it goes to the governor. Um, Now we'll talk about each of these steps in a little bit more detail. Sometimes when you hear about a legislative proposal, or especially if it's at the point where you're reading about it in the newspaper, it's probably quite a ways along in the process. Um, it might be a bill that's already been drafted and introduced, and then it gains attention of folks. But if there's something that you're interested in working on, proactively, um, you can get involved at a very early part in the process, including during bill drafting. Um, Legislative offices often will work with organizations or individuals if it's a proposal that person or group has brought forward, or if an individual or an organization is known as being particularly expert on an issue. Legislators may often will often go to them for their comments on a particular bill draft. So while that often doesn't gain the media attention yet, typically, it's occasionally a place where you can be active as an advocate. Um, Really, this is really once you've established relationships, typically, and you or your organization is known as a trusted source of information on a topic. Or again, like I said, if it's something that you have proactively brought forward to a legislator seeking a bill to be drafted. Um, but it's an important part of the process because uh, uh, I've certainly seen many times where bills have been drafted, um, and perhaps there have been mistakes in the drafting. Perhaps there was something not necessarily a drafting mistake, but something that was included in the language that was has some unintended consequences. That folks haven't obviously thought of. It might not be uh, supportive of. So I know from our end here at WCASA, we always are looking to be involved and have input as early in the process as possible. Again, if it's a bill that you're interested in and trying to move proactively, you really want to make sure that what's drafted is exactly what you're interested in, and what will have the consequences that are intended. Part of this process, then, once a bill is drafted, is that co-sponsors are uh, sign on to sign on to bills. That can be an important step. You will often see a handful of co-sponsors. Sometimes you see bills with long lists of co-sponsors. I know I worked on a bill last session where we had 42 co-sponsors, and the fact that that was such an extensive list, and depending on who is on that list of co-sponsors, that can influence other legislators. That's a bit of an indication to them of level of support, how much something has been vetted, and so on. So if you're involved in a bill from the early stages, uh, you can be active in, for instance, if it's something you support, trying to get other offices, recommending to them that they sign on as co-sponsors, that kind of thing. That can be pretty powerful. Not isn't always determinative of final outcome, of course, but it's just one more sort of tool that you have as an advocate, and one more sort of step to keep in mind. Now, as this is happening, once co-sponsors are had, bills are assigned to committees. This is also a pretty critical step. It's not always a given which committee a particular bill will go to. You might have something for instance, again, in our area of work here, the criminal justice related, but it might be something that could go to a committee that works on public safety. Perhaps that's concerned with the judiciary, maybe a separate, criminal justice committee. There typically are a couple of different options for bills, at least, and um, it can be important where that bill goes. if the bill has a lot of support, if it has um, champions in the majority party, for instance, uh, probably is going to go to a committee where folks are all right with it moving along and getting a public hearing and so on. But again, you just want to keep in mind, and what I want to stress at this point is just to keep in mind these various steps and the fact that a lot of thinking does go into each of these steps as far as which committee is it going to and why, and who is a co-sponsor and who isn't, and all of that. These are just things to keep in mind and to, if possible, and if you're involved at this early stage, to weigh in on. The public hearings, which typically occur for bills, not always. There are times when that's not done. And certainly, I want to also stress that even when a bill's been drafted and introduced, it's not a given that each of these following stages ever occurs. In many bills, uh, for lack of a better term, die in committee, for instance, don't really move along the process, whether because they don't have much support or um, perhaps it's in a committee where that committee itself might not be very supportive, or they might be worried about the bill for some reason. Even if there's other, legislative support from others, it might not move forward. But if a bill is moving along in the process, the public hearing is what will happen next. And this, of course, is one of the more obvious opportunities for advocacy. It's one of the more and one of the few sort of public, obviously public opportunities to make a statement on a bill. Um, but I do want to suggest that by the time a bill has gotten to the public hearing stage, a lot of work should typically have been done already. The public hearing should not be viewed as the sole or even, frankly, most important advocacy opportunity here, in the legislative process. Now, I don't want to suggest they're not valuable. I'm certainly not suggesting they're not valuable and important to take part in, but they're really just one of the stages that you need to be aware of and, as an effective advocate, need to be involved in. Having said that, they are an excellent opportunity. You might be, it's where there's a public showing of, people's personal stories, perhaps. If it's something we're working on here at WCASA, it might be something where we're a bill that we're able to bring in some expert testimony on, whether it's, I know in the past, whether it's a forensic nurse, for example, or a sexual assault services, advocate to talk about a measure and to talk about the impacts of that bill. So they are a very useful stage. You can also often get the media interested in an issue once once the bill has gotten a public hearing. I certainly have worked on issues where uh, it's been difficult to get the media interested, before this stage. If they don't think it's really moving forward, they're less likely to spend their time, writing about it or uh, uh, getting footage for the evening news. Um, it's also a time to show the support that you've already been able to gather for a bill. For example, if other, uh, to get other organizations to come and testify, other individuals. It's an opportunity to show really the work that hopefully has been done already. Um, you typically would hope that going into a public hearing, there aren't a lot of unanswered questions. You want to try to get an understanding of that ahead of time. Hopefully, you've thought through or been able to talk to groups who may oppose a bill you're interested in. Um, you want to gain as much of an understanding of what that possible opposition is ahead of time, and try to shape that public hearing as a real opportunity, as I said, to show the support that exists for that. And really is an opportunity to show legislators why they should keep moving forward on that particular bill. Once a committee, after a public hearing is held, Sometimes it's done on the same day, but typically afterwards, that committee will then hold what's called an executive session on that bill. That's simply when they vote on the measure. They don't typically take public testimony at that time. They're voting themselves as a committee on whether or not the bill is going to be sent to the full House. So if it's an assembly committee, they'll vote, and if it passes that committee, a majority of committee members vote for it, it'll move on to the full assembly in that case. Uh, Same on the Senate side, of course. Once it's moved on to that stage, you really want to be getting a sense of where does this stand, for that House as a whole. Do you have the votes that are necessary? Now, committees typically are given quite a bit of deference. If a committee has worked on an especially thorny issue or a technical one, and it's worked out the very specific issues surrounding that bill, perhaps the bill's been amended in committee to answer some questions or to improve the legislation in some way. Um, Legislators will typically not want to debate every single bill in full on the floor of that full House. Committees will be given some deference there, but as we see, they do debate bills in the full houses, um, and so you're certainly not done, and certainly can't rest assured once a bill has passed committee that it's necessarily going to become law at that point. Though you're uh, generally, if it's passed committee, you've got quite a bit of support clearly already. At that point, then you can also start gaining an understanding of, as I said, where your votes are in the full House, and you can uh, contact legislators and take a roll call, as it's called, of where folks stand, and typically gain a pretty good understanding of where they stand on a particular measure. A lot of times you may not get an answer on exactly how someone is going to vote on the floor, but you can by making that communication and simply asking, you can typically gain a pretty good understanding of how much support a measure has or not. During those full House sessions, then those floor periods where, for example, in the Assembly, they're taking up a measure, going to debate it and perhaps vote on it. That's a key opportunity, not for you to make a public statement, of course, but for you to provide support and key information to those who do support the bill. So that might be a matter of making sure uh, key legislators have your talking points and know, and this is quite important actually, know what some of the questions may be that other legislators pose, things like that. Um, and it's also a time where you can try to make sure that those who do support your bill or what the bill that you're interested in, um, you can urge them to speak up if necessary on the floor and in support of your measure. Now, as we go through this, obviously we're assuming things have succeeded at each stage and the bill is moving along. Um, and then it obviously comes down to the governor. But one thing I say to folks a lot, and I try to remember myself, is during your advocacy work, as bills move along throughout this process, committee to full House, all of that, it's a common mistake to forget about the executive. Um, and wait until after the legislature has voted on a bill, uh, until groups contact the governor's office and ask about, try to measure their support. Um, it's a very important part of legislative advocacy to be engaged with the governor's office at a much earlier stage in the process. Um, is just really is a critical matter. Um, you're not always, again, going to get an answer to the question, would you support this or not support this? but you have the discussion, and you might hear questions that questions might be raised. Um, Other issues might uh, be spoken about that kind of tip you off to where the governor might stand, um, and also where others might stand who have perhaps already contacted the governor on the issue as well. You always want to be looking for uh, what those opposing questions or viewpoints are. Very little legislation is sort of sneaks through. You really can't be hopeful to um, uh, fly under the radar, I guess, on public policy. It's for the most part not how it works. And engaging those who might be opposed to a particular measure, while always a strategic decision, you you want to be aware that you're going to have to do that, because legislators and executives are going to hear from variety of viewpoints, and if you are honest about what those other viewpoints might be and try to answer those questions as early in the process as possible, the better off you'll be. It also can help at times if you've got you've got a governor who's supportive of a particular measure. That can actually help with the legislative advocacy as well. This is obviously more true when there are good relationships between the legislators and the governor's office, something that differs, from session to session, frankly. Um, but if they're pretty much on the same page about a variety of things, um, you can have times where a governor being on board and whether they're willing to publicly voice that support yet or not, it can be helpful in your legislative advocacy. We're going to move now to legislative advocacy tips themselves. I don't think we have any questions yet. Is that right, Stephen? But folks should feel free to um, chime in with questions at any time. And as Stephen said, we'll take those as they come or after each section here at least. When it comes to legislative advocacy, one thing I talk to folks about a lot is how they view themselves in the process. And that might sound a little silly, but um, I have seen over the years that how someone or an organization views themselves in the process itself, and the role that they see themselves playing in the process, will dictate quite a bit their actions and, or in the end, their effectiveness as an advocate. And what I mean by that is when organizations or an individual sees themselves as an integral part of the process. In other words, and I guess we're getting back to sort of for government, or for people by the people kind of stuff here. Um, when individuals or organizations see themselves as a necessary and integral and important part of the government and policymaking process, that will really dictate their actions, and over time, it will be much more effective. Now, as compared to what? Some people say, well, as compared to seeing themselves or yourselves as outside the process, but then occasionally hoping to kind of step in and influence that process. That's a different sort of approach. That's a different approach, and over time, it will not be as effective as an advocacy approach. But I'll get into more of that in a minute. But I want to urge you to think of yourself as an integral part of the process, to think of the relationships and to think of your communications and interactions with policymakers as part of developing long-term relationships. Um, we'll talk about the need to actually communicate. There are always examples of even organizations that may have a lot of capacity, but then fail to turn that into actual communications. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about advocacy. We're not talking about simply being wise about the process or being smart about a particular measure. Advocacy is about communicating. It's about communicating with decision makers and trying to influence the decisions that are made. And persistence. And we'll get to each of these in a
You just because I had to tap on another thing.
Okay.
Now it should work fine.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
And I went into this a little bit already. But it is true. Like, as I said before, uh, generally speaking, policy does not sort of fly under the radar totally, or isn't done in private. Um, Groups and individuals will be out there trying to influence legislation. Uh, Everyone has a right to do that. And for many people and many organizations, you have a responsibility. If you're running or with an organization whose mission is to uh, I don't know whether it's to work on housing issues or whatever it might be. Uh, you know, you've I would suggest you've got a responsibility. Now, obviously, we get into capacity and staffing and all of that kind of thing, but everyone has a right to influence the decisions that are made by government, and you can be sure that others are trying to do so. My point is that you might as well uh, join that. When it comes to building relationships with policymakers, people try to do this in all sorts of ways, right? And we see this occur, and we hear about some extreme cases. And I will be the last one to suggest, for instance, that that money doesn't play a role in our electoral processes here in Wisconsin as elsewhere, and that doesn't have any impact on policy making. You just hear in the news all sorts of ways, right, that people are trying to build relationships. Well, the fact is, relationships are built in a very many ways, and similar to any relationship you're going to have with another human being. Um, I describe these always as, you're trying to build long-term relationships, not necessarily monogamous ones, because you want to reach out to lots of folks. But relationships are about trust, and the only way you develop that is over time and through repeated contact and communications, just like any kind of human interaction. Um, and so, for example, in the slide, reaching out to legislators consistently. If you haven't been in touch with your legislator in a while, if you're with an organization, invite them out to your facility, depending on what you do. Go in for a meeting just to touch base, talk about what you're up to, things like that. Instead of, again, just going back to them when you want something or when you're kind of desperate to impact a particular bill that you think is critical. You'll be much more effective in your advocacy on those things if you've tried to build relationships kind of continuously and consistently. And if you do that, you'll see, and we see this all the time, if you make an effort to consistently connect with policymakers and you develop those relationships, you will become a source of information and source of expertise on a particular issue or set of issues for them. That is a role, that is a very important role for advocates. Is that these are two-way relationships here, and a very important role for advocates, whether an individual or an organization, is to be a trusted source of information and to help policymakers make good decisions. It's not just the other way, where you're trying to influence something that's done or get something done at a single point in time. But once you've established relationships and policymakers turn to you, which will happen, uh, some people find that hard to believe, but it will happen over time. Um, you will be contacted for your opinion on issues, and you'll know at that point that you're reaching a level of effectiveness, that's pretty good, pretty strong. And it's not just with legislators and the staff, the media. It's the same way. If you've been active on an issue or set of issues for some time, you'll start getting the calls instead of needing to try to get stories placed in the paper or get your input into the media stories. They'll start turning to you. Now, communications, that's what I said this is really all about. And I stress this because I've just seen so many examples over the last 12 or so years of groups not doing this. Now, obviously, there are times strategically when you decide what to say and to whom and how much. Um, but if you're not communicating in the end, we say it in the capital I, if you're not in the room and you're not communicating, you're not going to be effective. Um, I find that folks who work on issues where they're very passionate about those issues and they work very hard on them and perhaps they've become quite expert on them, there's a tendency to make a lot of assumptions then about how everybody knows about this particular, particularly a very important issue or development, make assumptions about other people caring to the degree you care. Um, and those assumptions are often wrong, um, at least in the sense that legislators and staff and other policymakers, agency personnel and others, um, they have a lot coming in front of them. They have a lot of people coming in front of them kind of continuously. If you're not there having those communications as well, chances are the issue is not really on their mind, or it will be difficult once the vote comes to them for them to just all of a sudden, learn everything they need to learn. You need to communicate, and you need to communicate consistently. Now, I get the question a lot. Well, how to communicate? What's the best form of communication? Is, is email any good? Or often we see during policy campaigns, pre-printed postcards. Groups suggest send this into your legislator, and versus written letter. And I think my opinions have changed over the years. Probably, I'm still a big believer in letters, and I've had a lot of legislators say to groups, that's probably more likely to come in front of me and to land on my desk. Uh, but the fact is, offices track communications with, especially with constituents, on issues. And if email is what you can do, you should do it. But the main point I want to make is you shouldn't refrain from communicating just because you think, I don't have time for a visit, I don't face to face, or I don't have time, or I'm not able to get him on the phone. Don't let that stop you from communicating. Do something. Now, what we typically do, and what I typically recommend is doing more than one thing. If you have had a visit with a legislator or a staff person, whether in the district or here in Madison, or whether you've written or had a phone call, a phone conversation, follow that up with a letter, or follow that up with an email. It's a chance to reiterate some main points. It's a chance to provide information that may have been asked about in that first communication. But again, you want to establish regular communications, and so you should think of the various ways you can communicate as simply as different tools that you have at your disposal. Over time, people will get more comfortable. Now, I don't know your experience level, but it's always folks are often a little wary. They have a sit down with the legislator or staff, or talk to someone on the phone. This is the kind of work that you, like most things, you just get more comfortable with the more you do it, and you start to see how folks want to hear from you, and legislators typically want to hear from their constituents. Um, so the more you do, the more comfortable you'll get as well. And that's important if you're for your own communications, but also if you're at an organization where you're trying to turn other people out, doing grassroots advocacy work, getting members of the public to make a communication about something. You always want to stress, do what you can, do something, and then try to help them do something a little bit more, because they'll get more comfortable over time as well. And the fact is, many pieces of legislation take more than one session or more than 1 year to get passed. I've worked on a number of issues over the years where it's certainly taken more than one legislative session for a bill to get passed. Now, obviously, procedurally, it's got to be reintroduced and go through that whole process we talked about earlier. But it's definitely true, and I'm not sure that it's a bad thing. It's probably a good thing that you often have to go through a process of educating policymakers on an issue, educating the public as well. If it's an issue that the media then writes about, people may have a lot of questions about it. That's our process. You've just got to be persistent. It is very common for bills to take more than one legislative session to become law. Some I've seen take 4 or 5 sessions, frankly. Um, it might take that long for, well, you might have turnover, obviously, in the legislature, and there might be folks who come in who are more friendly to the issue, frankly. But it also might be one that has to percolate a bit, and for the comfort level to get to the point where people are willing to vote for it. So just to go back very briefly, um, always know where in the process you are or a particular measure is. Is this a budget? First of all, is this a budget issue? Is this a regular legislative? Okay, it's a regular legislative bill. Well, where do we stand? Is it a public hearing that I'm reading about in the newspaper? Okay, well, that's where we are. Then understanding the various stages, you know now what's gone into it already, and you know sort of what's coming next. So you can target your advocacy based on that. Are we very early? Are legislators sort of thinking about an issue? Um, that allows you many more opportunities to get in there. And as we said earlier, with all those various stages of drafting of the bill and gaining co-sponsors and committee assignment, all of that you can weigh in on. But knowing where you are in the process is just critical. You've just got to do it. That also will help you recognize who the key decision makers are for that particular bill. Again, once it goes to committee, or once you know who the authors and the co-sponsors are. But it might be that a committee is going to be very key, and so then that lets you target your advocacy to those 5, 7, 9 members, whatever it might be. Nobody has time to run around contacting 132 legislators. I'm not sure that you want to, even if you had the time. But once you recognize who the key decision makers are, you can move forward then in an informed way. And then don't forget to actually make the ask and to make the communications. That's where the influence comes. It's very important to understand the process. It's very important to understand the issue itself. But if you don't communicate your needs and your opinions, your questions, whatever it is, well, that's just not it's not advocacy. You're not going to really have an influence on that particular measure. Now, I'm not getting into the specifics now of who's the best messenger with whom and all of that kind of thing. Those are all strategic decisions that you can think about and get better at over time. But for today's session, I just want to stress, don't forget to actually communicate your ask and your needs with policymakers, and to then be persistent over time. Policy generally can take quite a while before it becomes law. This is my contact information. Obviously, we here at WCASA are always available. Our policy team is available to talk about issues you might be interested in. Our next webinar will deal with sort of keeping track of the things we've talked about. How do you find out and how do you keep track of legislation? Where does it stand? That kind of thing. But people often don't have time to, so that second webinar will focus on that, and we'll give you some tips for keeping track of legislation and bill drafts and so on, which should help. But you should always feel free to contact me as WCASA's lobbyist or others here at WCASA with those questions too. You may have just read about something in the paper that legislators are interested in. Feel free to call us and ask us where that stands. We can help cut through the process a little bit for you. So I just want to go back and mention the next two webinars. The second one, again, Thursday, November 29th at 12 o'clock, will be focused on how to track what's happening with legislation, again, as I just said. We'll have some resources and links available on, frankly, pretty efficient ways, pretty easy ways to keep track of legislative developments that are no cost. There certainly are tools out there that you can pay for, I frankly find them unnecessary. There are a lot of free options for keeping track of legislation. And then the third webinar, which will be on the biennial budget process, will be on Friday, December 7th at noon. Now, I don't believe we've gotten any questions.
Yeah.
Um, so we will just sign off at this point.
Well,
But
or maybe
Stephen,
just hold.
go
Maybe,
ahead,
yeah, I was just
Stephen.
going to say, just maybe hold to see if there are any questions. Again, you can raise your hand and or type something in the text area, in the text question area. I was just going to say, just to reflect back, it was interesting, John. Because when we talk about having these conversations, we've talked in the policy team about the overlap and the connection with prevention work, because that's the hat that I wear predominantly in the agency. I can't help but thinking or drawing that connection where we're talking about having these difficult, both having the difficult conversations, i.e., you will interact with the legislator that going into it may have a dissenting opinion or maybe not as educated on these issues, and just allowing yourself to be in that space. We always use the phrase of meet them where they're at, right?
Sure.
And just the more you do prevention work, I think there's an analogy there as an agency to also being prepared for doing advocacy work at the policy level, because it is very similar in terms of having those conversations. And also similarly, what you said about being a more active part of the process, not just going in when there's a particular issue. Again, we too often think from an advocacy and intervention perspective of this has happened, we'll react. And when we're talking about prevention work, the idea of shifting the overall atmosphere, having that conversation being ongoing, so that you're not just speaking up when someone says something that's offensive. You're actually constantly trying to put that positive language out there and create that cultural shift.
Yeah, those are good points. And to the latter point, you know, and that's really a reflection of how the process really works.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we laid out here the specific stages that exist, and then what happens at each. That's a little bit of an indication of how it's more of a continuous or a longer process than simply that one point in time when they're going to vote on something. But really, if you think about what policymaking is, from idea to enactment of law, and frankly beyond that, implementation and then reaction to law and what the influence of a new law has been, it is a continuous process. So if you recognize that, I think that helps folks understand then the need to continuously be sort of part of the process and engaged. And briefly to your first point, yeah, I mean, we all have times when we're going into a meeting where, and there are times when you just know the person you're going to be speaking to is either opposed to a particular bill that you're in favor of, or maybe you think they're uh, opposed to a general idea that or notion that you want to raise, whatever it might be. That's certainly true. But I have found this. Um, it is appreciated by policymakers, by legislators and staff, agency personnel, whoever it is, that you're there anyway. And well, I guess I'd say a couple of things. First of all, you don't want to make too many assumptions there. You don't want to assume. I mean, sometimes you will just know, okay, this person has voted against this bill 3 times, whatever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But you don't want to assume too much, and you don't want to assume, well, I don't think this person is going to be difficult to talk to. People are always making mistakes along those lines, and you never know. I mean, so you might learn something when you go in and have a conversation with somebody. You might learn something about their own personal experience or about their life uh, that might have them in a different position than what you assumed they would be.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't know. But even when it's the case where, yeah, they're opposed and they're going to oppose something, first of all, there are strategic reasons to still go in,
Mm-hmm.
um, often, uh, but it's appreciated, and that will be remembered that you've gone in and you've laid out your points and you've been in a respectful way, in a professional way. Um, Again, just thinking of these as relationships, uh, there's really rarely, if ever, a time when you should